Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the 2004 Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. Our first session of the day, U.S. and Iraq 1 year later. Right to get in, wrong to get out, is about to begin. Please join me in welcoming our panel, Mark Danner, Christopher Hitchens, Michael Ignatieff, Robert Scheer, and our moderator, Steve Wasserman.
Welcome to UCLA's Royce Hall, to the 9th Annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, and to what amounts to a renewed debate, a kind of postscriptum to a debate and a discussion that was mounted a year ago at the Wiltern Theater on what was the eve of a war in which we are now enmeshed. At that time, we had the same gentlemen discussing grave issues that face the Republic. A year has gone by, a war was begun, a dictator was toppled, and we are still in Iraq. There seems to be no end in sight. Public opinion is divided. Much has happened. We thought we would reassemble and discuss this morning a number of issues that seem still to weigh heavily and to be enormously pertinent. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Christopher Scheer. Actually, Christopher Scheer, there is a Christopher Scheer, and he is the son of Robert Scheer, and together they have co-authored a book called The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. So I'm going to introduce Robert Scheer first.
I think that's the biggest compliment you could have.
Robert Scheer is also a syndicated columnist and appears in numerous papers, including preeminently the Los Angeles Times. I should say, if you could hold your applause, because we want to use the 2 hours insofar as is humanly possible to do everything we can to combat the soundbite culture of our time. So the time is precious, and we want to preserve it for as much discussion as we can. I'd also ask you to turn off all cells and pagers as well. Next to Mr. Scheer is Mark Danner, a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1990. He is reported from a variety of places around the world: Central America, Haiti, Bosnia, and most recently from Iraq for the New York Review of Books. He's just back, as a matter of fact, from Haiti as well. He's the author of The Massacre at El Mozote. He's the Henry Luce Professor at Bard College, when he is not also working as professor of journalism at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He is also the author in August of the forthcoming book entitled, provocatively, The Road to Illegitimacy. Michael Ignatieff is Carr Professor of Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. He is also the author, most recently, of The Lesser Evil: Political Ethics in an Age of Terror. And Christopher Hitchens is a well-known polemicist, a vigorous voice on all matters, and who insists on marching to the beat of his own drummer. He's the author, most recently, of Why Orwell Matters, and provocatively, and we hope accurately, The Long Short War: The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. He's also a contributing writer to Vanity Fair and the author of numerous books, including the re-release of a book entitled Blood, Class, and Empire, being published by Nation Books. We'll begin with Christopher, and we'll simply ask the obvious question: were we right to get into Iraq?
Thank you, Steve. Congratulations on your
Kim Jong-il eminence on the podium,
It's the white flag of surrender.
it will be, it'll be my submission, it is my submission, that the case for the removal by force of the Saddam Hussein regime was complete in all its essential terms long before George Bush became president. And this is because it confronted us then, as it does now, with the related problems that arise from, first, the rogue state, and second, the failed state. These two phenomena, separately or in combination, are the two greatest problems facing the post-Cold War world, and they had met their summa in Mesopotamia. Some related ambiguities arise from this duality, I think. The first question is, did one go in too early rather than too late? And which pretext or justification for this? Was it in our interests or in the interests of the Iraqi people, or both? Was the conflict with Saddam Hussein inevitable or justifiable? Was it optional? Was it, in other words, elective? It seems to me perfectly self-evident that a confrontation with Saddam Hussein had been inevitable at least since 1991, that it would probably be a good thing if this confrontation in its timing was chosen by us rather than, as on all previous occasions of crisis, left to Saddam Hussein to select. There wasn't, in other words, much of an elective element about this, nor was there anything novel or post-9/11 about it. It was the oldest problem on the political agenda of the United States. The regime change case is based on both these considerations. Saddam Hussein's regime met all the preconditions for a removal. It had sacrificed its sovereignty by committing all four of the violations that can lead to that sacrifice. These are, to refresh your memories, violations of the Genocide Convention, repeated invasions of neighboring countries, including the abolition, not just the occupation, but the abolition of a member state of the United Nations, Kuwait, repeated violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and a steady, consistent relationship with the gangs of international nihilism, terrorism, and jihadism. Those are the four conditions under which the United Nations can say that a state has forfeited its rights. Saddam Hussein had met them all generously and serially and repeatedly, as well as debauching the entire treasury of a very important country and privatizing it as the property of his family and his party. Of the two most controversial of the ones I've just mentioned, the weaponry and the terrorism, the best evidence has in fact surfaced since the intervention. As you'll find if you look into the David Kay report, as recently as March of last year, 1 month before the intervention, Saddam Hussein's people were meeting in Damascus with Kim Jong-il, or his representatives, I mean, to try and buy weapons off the shelf in production line form from North Korea. The North Koreans finally walked on this negotiation, keeping their deposit, I'm proud to say, because there were too many coalition forces arriving in the area. They thought it was too hot to continue with this plan. And second, on the matter of terrorism, the discovery, thanks to partly to the great efforts of the Kurdish military intelligence in capturing the memorandum of Mr. bin Laden's deputy, Mr. Zarqawi, calling for a religious sectarian war between Sunni and Shia in Iraq as the means of defeating American plans. Add that to the fact that the main man in the World Trade Center bombing of 1994 was an honored guest in Iraq until last April and had been ever since his arraignment. And that case, as well as the weaponry case, seems to me to have been demonstrated partly by the intervention itself. When people tell you, as they probably will, certainly often do, that there are people in this administration even who used to be indifferent to or even quite friendly to Saddam Hussein, they inadvertently make the same point that I am making. This recognition is a belated one, and it came belatedly. Anyone who was prepared to overlook the four conditions that I just mentioned, or to relax them, was in effect asking us to give Saddam Hussein the benefit of the doubt, to give him the presumption of innocence. There is no sensible way anybody could argue in favor of that proposition. I was and remain a great friend of the Vietnamese Revolution, and I don't like to see my Vietnamese friends insulted. So I won't say any more on this point, except that if you really want to wound the feelings of the Vietnamese, and if you really want to defame their long struggle against partition and occupation and for independence, Just compare them to the Fedayeen Saddam, or to the Khomeiniist or Wahhabist bandits who are now ravaging parts of Iraq. Iraq is not a Vietnam. It's on a giant scale what would have happened in Yugoslavia, what was nearly allowed to happen in Yugoslavia, or Somalia, or Rwanda, but in a gigantically more horrible way. Just for once, it was decided to assume this heavy responsibility in advance, to realize that we had inherited a broken, bankrupt, tyrannized, traumatized, maimed Iraq, so that we wouldn't now, or a little later, be having an inquest into how did Iraq implode? How did it go into the black hole? How did it become a Rwanda? Who was in charge watching this happen, watching it go through the eclipse of Saddam Hussein himself, through the delicious period that would have been the Uday Kusai Hussein interregnum, and the ensuing stirring up of ethnic, tribal and religious hatred, interventions of opportunity by outside powers like Turkey, Iran and Saudi Arabia. All of this was coming unless a coalition could be put together to put the country in trust. And if you don't believe me, why not ask the chief of bureaucratic prescience and current moral hero, Richard Clarke, whose advice it consistently was through the Clinton administration to leave Rwanda alone and let it run, and who hasn't yet managed to apologize, I notice, for that, though there he did have a responsibility. Now, Mr. Clarke and others have made it appear sinister that anyone could possibly care about Iraq before 9/11. To be found to have mentioned Saddam Hussein as a threat that might have to be dealt with before that date or even immediately afterwards is practically a conviction for conspiracy at present, instead of what it really is, something praiseworthy, a desire and a readiness to shoulder that responsibility. To put an end to the horror of the sanctions regime, which was punishing the Iraqi people while enriching their oppressors, to continue the honor of the no-fly zones that had protected northern and southern Iraq, the Kurdish and Shia populations, from further attentions from helicopter gunships and death squads, to put an end, in other words, to the state of affairs where Iraq was half slave and half free, and where the official West and the United Nations were running it in collusion with Saddam Hussein. That status quo was neither defensible nor feasible, nor would it have lasted. And all of that, or most of it, was clear by the year 2000, if not before. But after the dramatic declaration of jihad against our society in September 2001, I think we can say the matter became more stark. It was possible, perhaps, to consider persisting in limited police actions, like the arrest of the World Trade Center bombers of '94, their successful trial, or the tit-for-tat retaliations that occasionally took place after the bombing of an embassy here, the sinking of an American ship there. But even those police actions, limited as they were, demanded regime change in Afghanistan after 2001, and Afghanistan is now a NATO responsibility, and I do not believe that the fans of Mr. bin Laden and those nostalgic for the Taliban will succeed in defeating, or can consider defeating, the largest and most sophisticated military alliance the world has ever seen. Al-Qaeda as a crime family is finished. As a bent multinational corporation, it's been closed down. As a guerrilla group, it has at the most 2 of its prominent leaders still at liberty. This only leaves us, therefore, with the problem of what to do about jihad in general. And it seems to me very plain that the urgent need was and is to alter the balance of power in the region against the forces of jihad. There is a civil war going on in the Islamic world, and those who are on the jihad side of it hope to win this war, intimidate, terrorize, and bankrupt and enslave their own societies, in other words, by exporting this war to our society. In this, they must not be allowed to succeed. We have to intervene in that civil war and make sure it goes the other way. They say they'd like to change our society and our regime. Our reply is no, you will not be allowed to do that, but we will change yours. That's the only possible or correct response. Very important in the change of government in Iraq is this. Once the Iraqi oil industry is up and running again, which it will be thanks to the excellent efforts of Halliburton and others, you laugh, but who would you like to see in charge of the Iraqi oil? Was it not privatized when it was the personal property of Saddam Hussein's family? Which it will be. When Iraqi oil, as I repeat, is up and running as an industry again, they'll have more and better oil than Saudi Arabia does. The Saudi oil monopoly The relative stranglehold that Saudi Arabia and its Wahhabi oligarchy currently exert on the world oil market will be sensibly diminished. That's good, in my opinion, right? I'm going to be judgmental and simplistic about this. That's a good thing. The depraved mullahs of Iraq, who after a quarter of a century have beggared and ruined their country and have become discredited, of Iran, who after a quarter of a century in power reduced their country to nothingness and lost all their credit with their population, have also been put on notice. They've been forced to concede that they've been cheating on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Don't tell me that these concessions and these admissions would not have been wrung from them if it wasn't for the stand taken by the coalition in Iraq. And they've been forced to show their hand in preventing the holding of a decent election or even a parody of one in their own country, and their days are evidently numbered. And not even Mr. Chirac is going to be making any more excuses for them on the question of the weapons of mass destruction. All of these are pluses. They show that the regime change ethos is effective and workable in the region, as well as essential to the people who live there and to us also. There's a very interesting argument about what might have been done differently or better, and I like this argument, and I've been taking part in it. I tend to agree with my friend Ahmed Chalabi that it would have been a good thing to have elections earlier and to transfer of sovereignty sooner. I think I still agree with him that de-Baathification is more important than continuity in the professional and police and military services. There are many other things that might have been done better or differently or better prepared for, but do not, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, do not try and persuade yourself and do not try and persuade anybody else that the outbreak of banditry and thuggery in certain parts of Iraq is the consequence of any mistake made by the coalition. Do not think of it as the expression of a patriotic grievance. Do not refer to these fascists and sadists as insurgents or rebels. This is a well-organized attempt by the losing side, by the Wahhabist and Khomeiniist factions, now working in collusion with the former Ba'ath regime, to prevent a democratic transformation of the country.
Thank you very much, Christopher.
I'll have more to say if you press me. It's a start.
Mark Danner will speak next, recently returned from Iraq.
Thank you, Steve. Americans dream dreams. We wouldn't be Americans if we didn't dream dreams. And Iraq is a dream that for most of the country has turned into a nightmare. There are a few people who resolutely refuse to look at what's going on the ground, at what is happening every day in front of them on their television screens and in their newspapers. And there are some people who it's completely clear there is nothing that could happen in Iraq that would suggest to them that the war was a bad idea and has hurt American interests and has, in fact, made Americans less safe rather than safer. I've debated now with Christopher, I think this is the 6th time, and, or is it 8, or is it 10? I don't remember. In any event, it's very clear to me that, like our president, George W. Bush, there's nothing that could happen in Iraq that could persuade him that the invasion and occupation of this country was a mistake, even though today, as we stand here, gathered together 13 months after we were last together debating in Los Angeles, we are enduring the worst and bloodiest month of the war. Now, Christopher didn't mention this. In fact, he hardly, if you will notice, spoke about the war at all. He talked about what might have happened if it wasn't fought. He talked about the reasons for it, which was a rehearsal of reasons, many of which you've heard before ad nauseum, but which very few people are citing anymore, though he didn't raise weapons of mass destruction. He didn't talk about what's actually going on the ground. And I feel it's absolutely vital for us as Americans in an election year to take a look at this war that we are embroiled in, that is getting worse as we speak on this fine day in April, that will continue to get worse, and for which there is no plan to extract us and no plan to protect the American interests that this administration, by its decision to fight a war of convenience, not of necessity, has put at risk. This is a chart from the lunaville.org site. It lists casualties, American, Allied, and others. And you'll see that after the initial months of the war, where you had 65 dead, 73 dead Americans I'm talking about, not Iraqis, and then it declined to the mid-40s. This is when President Bush took his prance across the aircraft carrier just off the southern California coast and declared mission accomplished. We had numbers of death down, numbers of death up, spiking in November to 82 Americans dead. This was the Ramadan offensive when I was in Iraq. And now, as we speak, as of yesterday, 112 dead Americans, which works out, according to Lunaville, to almost 5 a day. You should take a moment to look around this hall. Pretty soon, I'm told that the bottom part of this hall holds about 800 or so people. We're almost at that point of young dead Americans in Iraq. Now, Christopher would say, as would President Bush, that, well, people die in war, and you exploit this issue by holding up this chart. The fact is, though, that more people are dying this month than died in the month after we debated here. And the policy in the future is based on a series of dreams. Dreams of a broad coalition, dreams of Iraqi security services, dreams of handing over sovereignty. One can summarize very briefly the Iraq War and the events that led up to it. First, the administration and those who argued relentlessly for war, a war that didn't need to be fought, relentlessly exaggerated the risk that Iraq and Saddam Hussein posed to the United States and its interests. Second, those who argued for a war of convenience, the administration and those who backed it, like Christopher and others, argued relentlessly, understated relentlessly, I should put it, the risks of fighting that war, the risks of occupying Iraq, invading and occupying Iraq. Let's talk a bit about this. Christopher went through many of the same arguments, although he conspicuously left out the weapons of mass destruction, which have proved not to exist.
That's twice you've said that.
Please, let me finish, and you can respond when your time comes around again, if you please.
Well,
the President called it a grave and gathering threat. At the last debate we had here, there was a general disparagement on the part of Christopher and others, disparagement of Blix, Chirac, Mohammed al-Baradei, and others who were doing inspections in Iraq, though the argument seems to be on Christopher's part that the regime was about to implode, his word, and that no war would be necessary, by the way, because the implosion would make any war strictly unnecessary. In fact, there was no evidence that the regime was imploding. And when we last met here, hundreds of inspectors were on the ground in Iraq trying to find the elusive weapons of mass destruction. Troops were on the border. Saddam was in his box. He posed no threat to the United States. It had been determined absolutely convincingly that there was no nuclear program in Iraq. The International Atomic Energy Agency had shown that, something that we knew before. And many of these things, by the way, that seem like revelations now, we knew before the war was fought. We knew it, which is one of the reasons why the last couple of months, as we've seen books by Blix, by Richard Clark, now by Bob Woodward, have felt like, to those who followed the war closely, or the beginnings very closely, like a bad movie played in reverse. Because these things are not revelations. They're things that we as American citizens knew about. So you had it was generally accepted that Saddam might have some weapons of mass destruction, might have some chemical weapons, might have some biological weapons. Many intelligence services accepted this. The administration doggedly, using a number of props like the aluminum tubes, like the non-existent uranium from Africa, exaggerated this reality, this suspicion, into the thought that, as Condoleezza Rice put it, the smoking gun might become a mushroom cloud. That is, that Saddam would soon get nuclear weapons. No one believed that. It was told to the American people again and again and again, and these claims were lies. We knew that before the war. We know it now, and we should think about this in this election year. We should think about the damage done not only to American security, but the damage done to American democracy by the process by which this president and this administration took us to war. Now, we went to war, the greatest catastrophe, I think, of going to war, apart from the war itself and the worsening conditions in Iraq, was the fact that we went virtually alone. We went against the wishes of the United Nations, against the wishes of our major allies, and we went with a kind of isolation that American policymakers have avoided since after the Second World War, when it was determined that American power, however great, can be maximized only by working with our allies and by enlisting the moral approval of the world for our actions. The Bush administration took it upon itself to go dramatically against this wisdom that had been handed down by 10 presidents. We find ourselves now in a condition of isolation that every day is growing worse. The Spanish have withdrawn and their allies. Other allies are growing weaker in their support. And the opponents in Iraq, the insurgents, rebels, whatever you'd like to call them, have played increasingly on this sense of isolation by attacking what few allies we have, by attacking the United Nations, by attacking the Jordanian embassy, by attacking the Turks, and so on. All right. My second point was that we were brought to war by a continual understatement of the risks of the occupation itself. The United States went into this war with a president who told them that the war would be easy, with administration supporters saying that it would be a cakewalk, with administration supporters like Christopher saying that we would be greeted with flowers and sweets on the streets of Iraqi cities, and more seriously still, by an absolute failure to anticipate the obvious political difficulties in putting together an Iraqi regime that can rule the country in peace and without violence. Saddam was there for a reason. He was a minority leader of a minority community in Iraq, the Sunnis, ruling over a majority Shiite population. The United States now finds itself in a situation where it does not know what to do. We are supposed to hand over sovereignty at the end of June. We do not know to whom we are to hand it over. No leaders have been selected. There have been 3 or 4 different plans that have fallen apart, and we have found out in the last few days that in fact this is going to be semi-sovereignty or limited sovereignty, that this Iraqi government that will take shape, we don't know from where, we don't know out of whom, will not have the power to make laws, will not have the power to change the laws that the Americans have passed during their time there, will not have control over the American forces, will not have control even over the Iraqi security forces. So one wonders what exactly this definition of sovereignty is. Meanwhile, the political position in Iraq grows more tenuous by the day. The Iraqi Ministry of Health gave figures for the number of deaths in Fallujah in the first 2 weeks in April. They estimated that more than 800 Iraqis had died in Fallujah. That battle is about to be rejoined. When Iraqis look on their television sets and see the fighting in Fallujah, they think Jenin. They think of what happened on the West Bank and the Israeli incursions there in the spring of 2002. And it is steadily whittling down any support for the occupation within Iraq, not to mention in the broader region. Christopher talked about building support, in the region against the forces of jihad. That is, this is a political war in which we must convince the Arab world, the Muslim world, that the United States is on their side and give them a vision of democracy. This is the predominant reason for this war that's been given after the evaporation of the weapons of mass destruction. Now, insofar as we can measure the success or failure of such an elusive goal, we can look at poll results. And we can discover, for example, that in our closest ally in the region, Jordan, before the war, 1 in 4 Jordanians felt favorably toward the U.S. During the war, 1% did, 1 out of 100. Now 5% do, 1 out of 20. And there are similar figures for all of the other countries throughout the Middle East. That is, the feeling toward the United States is relentlessly and increasingly negative, and the war is making it more so. Now, are these dreams, this notion of spreading democracy, this notion of giving the region hope, or is it something we can measure? Insofar as we can measure it, the war has been a catastrophe for American interests, for American approval in the region, and we now see, as we stand here in April, absolutely no way out.
Thank you very much, Mark Danner. Michael Ignatieff, your thoughts.
I supported the war in Iraq essentially for one reason, which is that in 1993, I spent 3 weeks in northern Iraq and spent time with the Kurds, went to Halabja where the Kurds had been gassed and massacred, spoke to orphans and widows, people who'd been killed in Saddam's Anfal campaign in 1987. I supported the war because I wanted to get rid of a man who'd committed genocide against a people, waged 2 wars within his region, and whether he had the capabilities that the Bush administration claimed, certainly had the intention to acquire capabilities that would threaten the region and the world. I went back to Iraq 2 weeks ago. I went to the northern Iraqi region, also known as Kurdistan, and what I saw was this. I saw 25% of the Iraqi population, that is the Kurds, live better, have better roads, have better schools, have got an airport, have had 10 years of self-government under the protection of United States and British forces. Please remember that. I'm not going to deny how difficult it is in Iraq now, but do come out of this morning remembering that for 5 million Iraqis, for people who've been massacred and gassed and pushed around, life is concretely, in simple and obvious ways, better in April 2004 than it was last year, and certainly better than it was in 1993. Okay, that's the first thing I want to tell you. The second thing I want to tell you is about preemptive war and about the case for war. I think you can only make a case for preemptive war, and I think you have to make a case for preemptive war because we can't wait to be struck. We have to take preemptive military action. That part of the Bush case I actually accept. We then, as citizens of a democracy, have to think about how you regulate preemptive war. I think you can only do so when the threat is imminent. I can think, secondly, that you can only use preemptive force as a last resort. And third, most important, you have to have the democratic consent of the people. Now, here's where, because I'm not interested in a kind of tit-for-tat with that side, I'm not interested in lining up with Chris, although I substantively support his position. But let's be honest about my position. I supported the war, and I supported preemptive war, but the threat was not imminent. We had not achieved last resort in diplomacy, although I think you could make a case that we were almost there. And the most troubling aspect, which troubles every one of us, and troubles me, frankly, is the issue of democratic consent. I've made the case that I would make for war, which is we need to get rid of a genocidal tyrant who's a risk to the neighborhood and who is not threatening us now, but sure as Sunday is today, is going to threaten us down the road. An honest case for this war, this is my problem, an honest case for the war that says the threat is not imminent, but it's coming down the pike, and we got to stop this tyrant before he hits us. That case, I'm not sure, would have persuaded the American people. That's the trouble on my side, to be honest with you. In other words, Mark Danner is right when he says that the threat was exaggerated. That is not good for democracy. That's bad for democracy. One of the things that has cost my side an enormous amount of legitimacy in this argument is the people who made the case fiddled with the truth, and I'm not going to be part to that. Okay, now, where are we now? Let me just, I don't know where we are now, but let me tell you let me tell you where we are not, okay? We are not in the middle of a civil war. There is an insurgency in the South led by one militia. He's making a power grab in a political vacuum to win support with the Shia. It's not a civil war. He's raising a militia to make a preemptive strike against the preeminent Iraqi cleric Ali Sistani. It's a battle for power. It is not a generalized civil war. Secondly, we are not in a general insurrection against the American occupation. There is a pocket, a really nasty, scary pocket. I don't want to deny the seriousness of this in Fallujah. These are tribal, clan-based groups with foreign fighters and ex-Baathists fighting the transition to democracy. They must be beaten. I don't quite know how. I don't want to have our soldiers fighting in the streets of Fallujah. I'd prefer to strangle this slowly, take our time, but they do not represent the whole of the Iraqi people. What we know from poll data is, one, they don't want us here. They don't want to be occupied. No sensible people want to be occupied. But they know that the only people holding the security situation together are all our American forces. They need American forces there to transition towards democratic self-rule. These people, supporters of Muqtada al-Sadr and the insurgents in Fallujah, do not, I believe, I'm not making an ideological point here, I'm making an empirical point, do not, I believe, speak for the Iraqi people who simply want to get on with their daily lives, elect a government of their own choosing, and get us out and run their own country and control the oil in their own name. That seems to me a perfectly worthy and useful goal. Third, so it's not a civil war. It is not a general insurrection against American power. And third, it's not Vietnam. It's not Vietnam because we're not facing the mass divisions of an enemy state. We are not facing a coherent nationalist communist ideology, and we are not going to lose 58,000 troops. Finally, we are not in a quagmire because there is, this is the only place I'd disagree with Mark Danner directly. We do have an exit strategy. Lakhdar Brahimi works with the Iraqis to choose a transitional administration. It takes power on the 1st of July. I don't like any more than Mark Danner the rubbish coming out of Washington to the effect that these people shouldn't have any real power. They must have real power. It's their country, not ours. That's number one. Number two, they work towards a constituent assembly in January 2005. That constituent assembly drafts a final constitution. At the end of 2005, there are general elections. We may not like the result, but that is a trajectory towards a democratic transition, okay? So there is an exit strategy here, and it's absolutely crucial that those timelines be kept to and that the faith that we have in democracy as a people is expressed in our faith in their capacity to become a democracy. Finally, just so we know how much trouble we're in, look at these candidates that you have to choose from this November. Number one, you've got a president who thought endlessly about phase 1, 2, and 3 of the military plan and delayed planning for phase 4, namely what you do once you've taken the country. He delayed it so long and allowed so much confusion to develop that we went into an occupation without a plan. We needlessly lost American and Iraqi lives because simple administrative and executive failures by our chief executive. He didn't understand the Pottery Barn principle of modern politics. You know the Pottery Barn principle? You break it, you own it, right? On that basis alone, this man may have forfeited your confidence. I say no more about the president because I'm not making a party political thing. I got nothing but bad things to say about all of them. Number two, we've got another candidate, Ralph Nader. He has a plan. The plan consists in speedy withdrawal. That's part of Plan A. Plan B is re-elect George Bush. But the worst news, my friends, is about candidate number 3. Because when asked what John Kerry would do about Iraq, he says, go to the United Nations, internationalize. Where Mark Danner is entirely right is the internationals are rightly heading for the exit. Because they understand the Pottery Barn principle. We broke it, we own it. And we have to fix it. John Kerry does not have a plan. He wants to internationalize something. He wants to get the UN involved. The UN is already involved. Lakhdar Brahimi is pulling our coals from the fire as we speak. God bless him. But the UN can't take over the assignment here. We need to follow the exit trajectory that I defined a minute ago. We need to stick to it. We need to drive it. If we believe in democracy, we need to transfer responsibility to the Iraqis. We need to make good on a promise. We didn't come here to occupy and tyrannize. We came here to liberate. We just better damn well do it. Thank you.
Robert Scheer.
Hi. First of all, it's a good sign that someone much younger than myself would get my name wrong, because I would be really scared if I had made an error like that. I do want to say, however, my son Christopher Scheer did actually write this book, and I am getting credit for it, so that's terrific. I hope that would happen some point in life, and it has. And the book, The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq, is depressingly accurate and has held up. Were not the case, trust me, I would not be hawking it, I would not be signing it, I would not be speaking here except in a deeply confessional tone. If the United States had gone in and found weapons that the UN inspectors would not have found, if they found the scientists who were not free to talk but now told us where those weapons were, if they had found the links to September 11th and to Al-Qaeda, if they had found the drones that could unleash these weapons on our country, if they had found this nuclear power weapons industry, that Condoleezza One could be the smoking gun, a mushroom cloud over Chicago and New York, had they found any one of those points, I would be deeply shameful for the way I work. I would question my methodology. I would wonder what had happened to me and my common sense. And the fact, forgetting about other members of this panel, the fact that the neoconservatives, the people who drove this policy, who supported it in and outside the administration, have not a single moment of doubt, hesitation, self-examination is, to my mind, truly alarming. And even Tony Blair is quoted in the Woodward book, which spoke to British Parliament and said that he had doubts when he saw the bodies coming home. Our president doesn't want us to allow us to see pictures of coffins. How can we make decisions about war and peace if we can't see pictures of coffins? If we can't look at the consequence? How dare a president in a democratic society tell us that we cannot look at the dead and wounded? We cannot study them. We cannot know the stats. It's ridiculous. How can we make a decision without knowing the ultimate implication of those actions? And when Woodward asked Bush, do you have the doubts that Tony Blair expressed? Tony Blair said when he got those letters from people whose kids had been killed, some of these kids are just barely out of high school, got killed in Iraq, he said, of course I have doubts. Our president said, no doubts. No doubts. And I could tell that to the public. It's alarming. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a representative of the Bush administration on this panel. Christopher may represent Chalabi, but Chalabi does not seem to have much of a following in the country. He seems to be in the process of being bypassed in the new coalition that will represent all Iraqis. And I must say, I don't think Christopher would make a very good representative for this administration, because as far as I can see, the source, the reason for going to this war, since the president admits in Woodward's book very clearly, and they haven't denied this, gave him more time than he gave any other reporter, the president admits that he found the so-called evidence of weapons of mass destruction to be paltry, would not convince John Q. Public, and would not convince him. He. It is also admitted in the Woodward book that there were no links to al-Qaeda, to bin Laden. So the whole justification of the war, that there's this international terror force, that because of the terrible tragedy of 9/11, we had to bait and switch, to use Colin Powell's words, and take attention away from Afghanistan, take attention away from the war on terror, not examine it at all, stonewall any investigation. In fact, appoint a man that Christopher, I don't think, admires very much, Henry Kissinger, to lead this investigation. So, in Christopher's words, a war criminal to lead our investigation of the biggest tragedy that's happened in this country. And then stonewall. It meant this administration did not want to know about this tragedy, but instead wanted to exploit it, to deceive the American people, to con them into another adventure that they had on their mind from day one, as Paul O'Neill, as Clark, and as the Woodward book amply confirmed. We are at a book festival. Books are the first draft of history, and we now have damning evidence that the American people were lied to in a dramatic fashion. The representative democracy was mocked in an extreme way. And not only did we give the back of the hand to the United Nations, which we created more than any other country, we gave the back of the hand to any other democratic society that dared, where the leader dared follow the wishes of the voters. We said the Germans are must have the wrong DNA to be warriors. They're just ultimate pacifists. We said the French would not ever dare be colonialists, ignoring the Battle of Algiers and their years in Indochina. And now the Spanish. Oh, well, they're just wimps, because they dared elect somebody who would do what 90% of the people wanted to do all along, not go into Iraq. So the biggest tragedy in this whole thing, the biggest cost, the reason why it was wrong to go in, is that we never used to believe the ends justify the means. Now, those of us on the left, when we have made errors, it's precisely because we believe the end justify the means. That's the lesson we should have learned from our history. The fact is, if you use a noble means, you will end up with a noble ends. That's what we're seeing in Iraq. It doesn't matter what you state after the fact. Secondly, what we're seeing is that the American people will not ultimately, and this is the Vietnam analogy, if you like, will not ultimately, yes, they're patriotic. Yes, they want to defend the country. Yes, they want to fight terror. But once they get the idea that they've been lied to, they won't follow. They won't needlessly sacrifice their young. They won't pay for the cost of this. And in objecting, they will be doing their patriotic duty. That's what they'll be doing. So it seems to me the real cost of this war, the real issue, is that we held up a model of democracy that we wanted to sell to the world, a model of limited government, checks and balances, a free press, and we will even impose that on the world from time to time. And what did we do? We shamed that model. We disgraced that model more than any enemy of democracy could ever do. It'd be best if you hold your applause, because from previous experience, that will only cause Hitchens to attack the audience, and we'll forget about the whole subject. So forget the applause.
Well, some people will clap anything.
Okay. Wait, let me just finish. But I think that is the serious issue here. We had, and it's Democrats and Republicans, Congress is supposed to wage war. Congress is supposed to allocate funds. We know now about the $700 million. We know that 72 days after 9/11, this president took his Secretary of Defense aside and said, let's go after Iraq, and use funds that were supposed to be going to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. I would think that would be a crime that would get somebody impeached, more than a blowjob. No. We know that this administration didn't care about the war on terror. We know that from what, not only the inside books, but from their actions. Let's go even further. When the Clinton administration, which is now attacked for being wishy-washy and so forth, and I have my own criticisms, but the fact is when they sent those cruise missiles in, Clinton was attacked for this wag the dog scenario of distracting our attention from the important business of Monica Lewinsky. Let's not forget that. And the people who were then beating up on Clinton didn't make the arguments now that are made against criticizing the president. They didn't say you're weakening the President of the United States by going into his sex life or the phony Whitewater scandal, which you hounded with him from the first day. They didn't say anything of the sort. They didn't care about this terrorism. And when this new administration came in and was informed by Sandy Berger and others about this problem as being the most pressing, what did they do? They ignored it. And let me say something. We hear a lot of attacks on the left, on the peace movement and so forth, which, by the way, got it right. 15 million people around the world protested against this war. They were right. They didn't need it. Big sources, you know, didn't have to be big experts. Okay, but what group warned us of something this administration never seemed to grasp, that bin Laden and the Taliban were one and the same and were a horrible menace? Guess what group? It wasn't the Hawks. It wasn't the neoconservatives. It wasn't Paul Wolfowitz. It wasn't the right wing. No, it was the Foundation for a Feminist Majority, Peg Yorkin, Mavis Leno, people like that. And for 5 years, they made a movie called Behind the Shroud. People smuggled into Afghanistan, and for 5 years, they tried to warn us about this monster of our creation, by the way, the Mujahideen that we had brought to Afghanistan in the holy war against communism, the people we had supplied Stinger rockets to, the people that we had called in battle plans. And by the way, as long as we're mentioning the crimes of Saddam Hussein, I'm sick and tired of hearing this thing from the president and others about the genocide of Saddam Hussein. Yes, the guy was a genocidal killer, a monster, so forth. He's a secular genocidal killer, a monster. Let's not forget that. He was an enemy of bin Laden. But leaving that aside, this constant reference by this president to use weapons of mass destruction against his own people. When will the media ask this president if that's the case? And he used them in 1987. He even used them before Rumsfeld went there and shook hands with him. He used them before, you know, we were giving massive aid. In fact, those mass graves existed back then before your father extended $1.2 billion in credit to this mass murderer. Now, why do you come back a decade later with a defanged leader who, by the way, could not control the Kurdish area, which was protected? And if you're going to liberate those Kurds, you got Kurds in Turkey and elsewhere, you better watch what you start. But they weren't being threatened. And the fact of the matter is, it's an excuse. It's another way of lying. So we try to figure out what motivates this administration, and I don't want to get personal here, but I think Christopher is a poor representative, because my reading of the literature is that there's an appeal to an almighty. Okay, so after Kissinger, we have the almighty, another group that Christopher has not taken to defend much. Now, I will admit, when I first saw Woodward on 60 Minutes, I wrote a column. I thought the Almighty being referred to, because he said it's a higher. He didn't talk to his father, who knew a lot. He didn't talk to Brent Scowcroft. He said, I talked to a higher father. You know, that's in the Woodward, but not denied. I thought he meant some kind of notion of God, Almighty. It turns out, on reading the book, he really meant Cheney. You know, because there is not really a scene in this book where Cheney is not present. And as long as we're mentioning, I'm sorry, I'll end on this. As long as we're mentioning Cheney, I didn't see that, apologize, you can take it on my time after. As long as we mention Cheney and Powell, don't forget one thing. In Powell's comments in the Woodward book, in addition to that, if it's broke, you own it, he said our vice president had a fever. That's a sign of deranged. A fever that he wouldn't let go of to go after Iraq. And our president caught that fever. That's the scary thing that happened.
May I make a simple request? I know that it is tempting for some to applaud sentiments with which you agree. It is more difficult to applaud sentiments that challenge presumptions and prejudices you may have entered the hall with. But it may even be more difficult to be mindful of a very large audience that is now watching this program thanks to the considerable generosity of C-SPAN. So I ask, please hold your applause until the end. We'll now have rebuttal. Christopher Hitchens.
Bob slightly does force me to say this, ladies and gentlemen. You are slightly too easily pleased, I think, and too easily amused, too. And I was, of course, bearing in mind the sober, calm C-SPAN audience in my remarks, and wasn't bidding for any affection from you lot. Just a factual point of rebuttal. I hope you'll bear me out this far. I did refer twice to the attempt by the Saddam Hussein regime as late as last March to acquire weapons of mass destruction and the means of delivering them off the shelf from North Korea. You can read it all in the David Kay report. It's a very fascinating piece of work. Hans Blix would never have found that out, by the way, so I have to resent Mark Danner saying I didn't touch upon this question. We wouldn't know about this also if that disk and related documents hadn't been captured during the intervention. Bear in mind also that not even Blix will be able to tell you that Saddam Hussein ever came into compliance with the most decisive of the UN resolutions, and this fetish of the United Nations, I think, deserves a little reconsideration in light of the fact of the double dealing done by two veto power members of the Security Council, France and Russia, and in what seems to be a very unpleasant unfolding scandal about the administration of the UN Oil for Food program. I don't like being teased or jeered at about the Iraqi people's reception and Kurdish people's reception of the liberation forces. I did see, everywhere I went, people of all ages and conditions welcoming and greeting and showering American and British and other forces with gratitude, and I shall never forget it. And I shall never abandon those people either, and I resent the tone of those who can't wait to do so. When I first heard the Pottery Barn analogy, which was, I think, from that great stateswoman Maureen Dowd in her column, I at first thought it was unpardonably flippant, but on reconsideration, I'm more inclined to take the line that Michael Ignatieff does about it, though with a different emphasis. Remember the motto, the mantra, you break it, you own it. I hate to keep on about this, but all of this was decided before the name George Bush could be brought into play. In other words, to play on the feelings of those who don't like the president. By 1998, when the Senate had passed the Iraq Liberation Act without a single dissenting vote, and after a very long deliberation, that it should be the policy of the United States to remove the government of Saddam Hussein, not only was Iraq very badly broken, extremely badly broken, maimed, shattered, under sanctions, as well as under political terror and the threat of renewed genocide, but we also already owned it. We had inherited that responsibility. Those sanctions were ours. There was no alternative to having them. The terrible thing was to collude with both the sanctions and the regime and have to patrol the north and the south from the air, being fired on every day, a virtual declaration of war as it was. Iraq was already broken, and it was already ours, and I will repeat this as long as I have to, long before any cheap jokes can be made by or about Richard Clarke or Dick Cheney or Paul Wolfowitz. And the acceptance of that responsibility is the test of seriousness not just of our leaders and our politicians, but it's the test of seriousness for you, ladies and gentlemen, as citizens and voters. And I wish you'd face it a little more stoically, because that's where we are now. How much longer would you have liked to let it run? Would you have liked to see what the Uday Qusay regime would have been like? Would you have liked to see the death throes of a regime that lived by divide and rule and stirring up sectarian and ethnic hatred? There would have been a Fallujah all across Iraq if that had happened, and there would have been no one to arrest it. Now, what's happening at present? The pilgrimages, the Hajj has been restored to the Shia. They can go to their holy cities again. The Sunni Iraqis can go across the border to Saudi Arabia, to Mecca and Medina again. A year ago, it was death to do that. It was as dangerous as to have a satellite dish. In the Naziriyah district of southern Iraq last week, during the pilgrimage and also during the unpleasantness in Najaf, There were municipal elections in 17 major towns. Husbands and wives were issued different coloured voting cards so that wives could go and vote at a time of their choosing. They didn't have to be brought by their husbands. The Islamic parties did very well in all these places. Good grief, there's that my time. But the secular parties won quite clearly and quite freely. That's what the jihad people want to prevent from happening. We should be very plain about this, and if we have underestimated their venom, and if there are more of them than we thought there were, well, that's fine. Because who will look me in the eye and say we haven't been at war with these people and looking for ways to find and kill and isolate and defeat and destroy them these many years? And only Howard Dean, it seems to me, would have the nerve to say that there was no jihad problem in Iraq until we got there, to blame the jihad on us. This ridiculous masochism of the sort of people who call the jihadists insurgents. And when you're done with Dean, you have a Democratic candidate whose indecision is apparently final.
We will now turn to Mark Danner for a brief rebuttal.
Very well.
The fact is that Iraq is on its way to becoming the next Afghanistan. And when I say that, I mean that it's becoming the cause of jihadist forces around the Middle East and around the Islamic world to go to Iraq. If you want to fight the Americans, if you want to fight jihad, if you want to do these things, you slip across the border in Syria, Saudi Arabia, even Iran, and join the jihad forces. And it's becoming a rallying cry of the new century, similar to the way that Afghanistan was the rallying cry of the 1980s for jihad forces then, which gave birth to, of course, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. One of the reasons that Fallujah has been boiling the way it has, one of the reasons why you've had suicide bombings across the country is because, not just because of indigenous elements, but because of foreign jihad fighters coming into the country. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that the cause that Christopher set forth and that the administration has, the political cause, the notion that after 9/11 we have to change their view, we have to give the Middle East hope, we have to show that there's a democratic way, has been stood on its head. And the U.S., in invading Iraq and occupying it, in invading and occupying a major Arab country, the second largest oil reserves in the world, has done the opposite of what it seems to have planned, which is give democratic hope to the region. Instead, it's given the opposite view. There was a piece in the New York Times the other day, Thursday, "Battle for Fallujah rouses the anger of Iraqis weary of the U.S. occupation." It's a fascinating piece. Ed Wong walked along the main shopping street of Baghdad, outer Karada, which is like, may as well be Times Square in New York. And he talked to people who should be the main main supporters of the United States. My opinion of the Americans has changed, one store owner said. When the Americans came, they talked about freedom and democracy. Now the Americans are pushing their views by force. All of us feel that. And the Times reporter, after coming up with many of these quotes, says, "People like Mr. Wakil and Mr. Hussein are the kind of middle-class Iraqis that the Americans are relying on to help them rebuild the country, with livelihoods already rooted in the spirit of free market capitalism. Yet their sense of kinship with Iraqis in Fallujah, Najaf, and elsewhere runs deeper than any pull toward abstract notions of democracy offered by the Americans, notions that to them appear increasingly hypocritical given the reliance of the occupiers on overwhelming force as a means to an end." Now, I want to take issue with something that Michael said. I agreed with a lot of what he said. There's no total insurrection in Iraq. There is a growing rebellion. There is no complete insurrection among Shiite. There's part of a rebellion there. I think it'll get worse. I said in a debate with Christopher in January that it'll get worse, and it indeed has. Michael said that he talked about the trajectory of an exit strategy. Don't worry, we have an exit strategy. Don't worry, we have elections planned. Don't worry, it's a step-by-step plan. Take a look at it. Well, you know, we've had several of these plans, and time and again we have missed these deadlines because, and this is the only way Iraq is like Vietnam, we have a military operation that is sinking into a political quicksand. There is no political basis for it. There is no political plan. There is no way out that suggests a way to put Iraq back together again. We can talk about elections in January, but if the fighting continues the way it is, there is nothing more vulnerable than elections. In the polls in 1987 in Haiti, a couple hundred people were killed. You get people gathering on the street and suicide bombers, you'll have a lot of people killed. You need some sort of consensus to stage elections. And elections and handing over power is the only way America can get out of Iraq, and it is unclear now how exactly it's going to do it. So the confidence in this plan that we're talking about is, I think, another way of dreaming dreams. And we're seeing those dreams melt in front of us. The first was they would recognize us as liberators, weapons of mass destruction, the Grand Alliance, which was never a grand alliance of the willing, but is now getting smaller and smaller. The Iraqi security forces taking over power. We hear again and again these numbers about the Iraqi army. I have a quote again from this weekend's USA Today, an American general talking about his forces melting away in Fallujah when they faced the enemy and they refused to fight. This is Iraqi forces. This is Major General Paul Eaton. Quote, "What I had was a battalion that just didn't understand why they were engaged by their own people." These were the Iraqi army, the new Iraqi army put on by the Americans, just didn't understand why they were fighting Iraqis. That doesn't point to a future and an exit strategy, the kind of exit strategy that Michael very optimistically described to you.
Michael Ignatieff.
I would like to emphasize something that Christopher Hitchens said earlier, which is, let's take our responsibilities here. Many of the criticisms made by Bob Scheer and Mark Danner are, it seems to me, pertinent. They are good descriptions of a bad situation. But then the question becomes, what do we do here? The tone in Mark Danner's rebuttal to you is essentially almost as if, I oppose the war, so it's not my responsibility. And I just think that's not where we are now. We're in a situation, this is the Pottery Barn problem. We have a responsibility now to make it work. It seems to me to be, of course there are problems with this election trajectory that I outlined to you. Of course it's difficult. I mean, what's the substance of what Mark is telling you? Yes, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult. But consider the alternatives here. We have to consider...
The point is that to talk about it, you have to look at it first, rather than dreaming about it.
Mark, just let me finish. I'm not dreaming here. I just began what I said, admitting that we are in a difficult situation. That is not the language of a dreamer. That's the language of someone trying to talk sensibly, like you, to an audience. What do you propose? I can't see any other political solution that makes sense than, if we talk democracy, to live by democracy. Give people a chance for the first time in their history to choose a transitional administration, put together the machinery for an election in January, get to final elections in the end of 2005. Will people try to sabotage it? Of course they will. Will people be killed trying to vote? Of course they will. Will people be intimidated? Of course they will, as the Madrid and Spanish electorates were intimidated in March. If you want democracy, sometimes you have...
Oh, you should hear how you sound when you do that, ladies and gentlemen. You can always tell where the morons are sitting when they hiss.
Please. In the interest of a certain decorum, please restrain yourselves and allow the panelists to finish.
Let's just clear up the Spanish matter, all right? The Spanish people know more about terrorism than any other liberal democracy, right? They're entirely entitled to vote as they wish to vote. If they wish, as Bob characterized them, to vote against the government that dragged them into the war in Iraq, absolutely their right, God bless them, fine. But let's be serious here. There was a very serious bombing 2 days before an election, and anybody who doesn't think that that's a deliberate attempt by terrorists to influence and tip the scales of a democratic election just isn't being serious. And if you think that isn't going to happen here, you haven't seen anything yet. That's where we're going, and that's why, if you're going to believe in democracy, we're going to have to be very tough. Mark keeps telling me it's difficult. Of course it's difficult. Of course it's difficult. What does he propose? We draw down, we get out? Yes. Oh, fine. And leave a people and leave a people to whom this country made a solemn promise, 26 million people.
Come on,
We made a promise to 26 million people, and let me tell you something else. We made a promise to over 600 people who've just shed their lives on behalf of this. So if we're going to get out, there's an element of betrayal. And we ought to be clear about that. I'm not dreaming any dreams. I'm trying to deal really with the hopes and expectations and opportunities that 26 million people have to live a decent life there. They're not going to live the way you and I live. The democracy they're going to get isn't going to look like the Founding Fathers' democracy, but it might be the first real democracy in this region. I think it's worth the effort. And of course it's going to be difficult. I'm just simply saying the thing about the other side of the House is they bear no burden of responsibility for telling us what we do now, how do we fix the situation, which I fully concede is just about as difficult as they portray. But the problem is irony here. Irony, we're too late for irony, ladies and gentlemen. We have to be practical, we have to be resolute, we have to be firm, and above all, we have to show a little basic courage, of which this country always has plenty.
Thank you, Mr. Ignatieff. And now to Robert Scheer.
You know, I've been up against this argument all my life. I was in Vietnam in '64, '65. We had sent flood control advisors. I said, leave this country alone, leave Cambodia alone. Somehow I became responsible for 59,000 Americans dying, and according to Robert McNamara, 3.4 million Indo-Chinese people. The analogy with that war is we were told those people could not manage their own affairs, they could not make their own history, and if we left, it would be this horror for them and for the rest of the world. We now have a situation where boat people are returning to Vietnam, where they're building their retirement homes. The consequence of our getting out, cut and run, was they went to war with China, an event never predicted by our experts. Red Vietnam went to war with red China. They didn't invade San Diego. We didn't have to fight them there or fight them here. So the whole web of lies were the same. And my own feeling, you're not going to gut check me with this thing about what we owe to the dead. You know, if I had written more effectively, if I had been tougher in '64, '65, if the peace movement had been stronger, we wouldn't have lost the 58, 59,000 people. We wouldn't have lost the millions of Vietnamese. So let me just tell you flat out, I don't think leaving is an immoral position. We are part of the problem. The longer we stay there, the deeper the problem becomes. We are creating enemy. We are uniting the Shiites and the Sunnis. We are building the fanaticism. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This was a secular society. Hate Saddam all you want. The fact is he was at war with the bin Ladens, you know, and we topple that. Now religious fanaticism has full sway. And I would point out, this administration has totally ignored the progress that was made on the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. Not a word about it, you know. And then to turn around and give Sharon a blank check. So instead of this war calming the area, we now have Jordan and Egypt at our throats. Jordan will not meet with our president, the King of Jordan. And we have the worst situation. If Theo's neoconservatives are friends of Israel, Israel does not need enemies. Israel has never been in a weaker position than now. But if you don't like the get-out position, I have a better position for you. The one you demeaned is the Kerry position. You know, we should do what we did in Afghanistan. After 9/11, we had the support of the whole world. We blew it. What is wrong with going to the institution that Eleanor Roosevelt, our government, did more to create than anyone else, saying to this institution, to these people, you were right. We didn't find those weapons of mass destruction. You were doing a hell of a job. Okay? We want you back in. Great nations can admit mistakes or they dig deeper into the hole. And we want you to come in not as a fig leaf, not to cover, as you were going to do with the coalition Iraqi government. Who's going to take that seriously? You can't control your own army, you can't control the Americans, but you're paving the way for democracy. I see nothing unrealistic or not pragmatic about going to the United Nations and saying, we want you to run this operation. Now, we have already been told by the Spanish government, by the French, by the Germans, by the Chileans, by plenty of people that we respect in this world, that were that the mandate, they would do what they're doing in Afghanistan. They would do what they're doing in the war on terror. The war on terror can only be fought with the cooperation of all of these governments and their police departments. They didn't cut and run on Afghanistan. They didn't cut and run on terror. They cut, if that's the word you want to use, against our folly. They know what the price of colonialism is. You're going to lecture the Spanish, the French, and German on what happens when you get into these follies? They know about cafes being burned up. So what I'm saying is that the position you demean, the Kerry position, is the one people should support in this election. My only criticism of Kerry is I want him to wage it more vigorously. I want Kerry to give the speech that he gave in Congress when he said, who's the last man to die for a mistake? You're telling me you want to send more young Americans to die for a mistake. So if that, what we need to do is get the new Kerry to be the old Kerry, you know? Because what that guy, what Kerry did was he said, okay, I'll fight for my country, you know? I'll buy your lie and hope it's wrong. I'll go there. I believe in patriotism. I believe in loyalty. He leaves after 5 months of wounds and combat and everything else, and he says, I'm not going to go off into the private sector. I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to form Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I'm going to debate it, and I'm going to bring my comrades, my buddies back home. It was the most honorable thing to do, and on its face alone, reason to make this guy president instead of a guy who got us into a dangerous war where people are killed.
We're going to use our remaining time to ask a number of questions, to try to think seriously about that enduring question, what is to be done? Whether the United States was right to intervene, whether it did so on a pretext which it knew disingenuously to be false, or whether it did so for moral purposes, high-minded purposes. The fact is there are 135,000 troops in Iraq today. The country is at war. Whether or not the exit strategies that have been proposed, some of which have been discarded, whether or not there is a mechanism in place that seems sensible, what is to be done now is very, it seems to me, very crucial. Let's just ask a question. Christopher, I put it to you. Even accepting, say, your argument, which I take it rests more on on the blood debt, as it were, that the United States owes to the long-suffering Iraqi people to rid themselves of a bloody despot who, to be sure, the United States helped to prop up, to coddle, to aid when it was convenient for the United States to do so. And in the end, let's say for the best of motives, recognizing the error of its historical ways, now having been presented by a history they consciously forged to undo the terrible work that they had done so much to advance, intervened, topple Hussein from power. Let us say that the standard bearers of that liberation, let us take them at their word to say that they are tribunes of democracy and a model that the Iraqi people in the widest number can enjoy. Isn't there a problem here in trying to make another people's history for them? Isn't there the great risk that the hubris required to do that will engender a reaction, not one of relief, but one, as time goes on, in which the occupied, even occupiers they may initially have welcomed, turn out to be those they feel they would like to be rid of? Isn't there a fundamental problem in not permitting people to make their own history? And doesn't that compromise the very effort the United States insists it's embarked upon?
Very well. You're even getting applause for a question. That's good. That's splendid, in fact. Let's see. The time to protest would have been 1998, I think, when the Senate adopted the Iraq Liberation Act without a dissenting voice, when it agreed and declared that Iraq had become our responsibility and that the sine qua non of future progress was the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime. That would have been the time to say, you're dragging us into a war with this, you don't have an exit strategy yet, this looks like an entrance strategy to us. That would have been the time to complain, and nobody did, because it was self-evident that one could not go on anymore in coexistence with the Saddam Hussein regime, either for the sake of the Iraqi people or our own. We didn't want either a failed state or a rogue state or the combination of the two. Those problems would not have been Vietnamese, as I told you before. They would have been Rwandan, Somalian, cubed, squared. And that's what we've avoided, by the way. And that really would have been a quagmire. Let's look then at the question of taking over Iraq's history for it. Put the case of the only part of Iraq that's been free of Saddam Hussein for longer than a year. Michael's already mentioned it. This is a release of the latent energies of the Kurdish people. There are 21 newspapers in Erbil. There are 3 female high court judges. There are enormous numbers of political reform. I think there are 4, maybe it's 300 now, American soldiers in those provinces of Iraq. I think they're mainly there for decoration. And the Kurds, if they wanted to have a national day, would probably pick the 4th of July. And indeed, recently they said to those who were there, don't worry, you can go to Fallujah if you feel you need extra troops. We don't need you here. That's the direct result of a regime change policy. It's something we could and should be very proud of having done. We've assisted the largest people in the region who don't have a state, the Kurds, to begin to acquire self-government. There are many more of them than there are Palestinians. They've been far worse treated, though no one has ever been hit by a Kurdish suicide bomber, and no one ever will be. This is a noble cause. We do right to be on their side. We want to repeat this in the rest of Iraq. It's going to be tough because we wasted 10 years. 10 years went to the locust in this matter. But since the entry of the coalition, first, Kurdish autonomy, second, reflooding the areas of the marshes, the largest wetlands in the Middle East that had been dried out, burned and destroyed by Saddam Hussein, UNESCO's greatest top of the top 10 of international crimes against ecology. The smoke from that destruction could be seen from the space shuttle. The Arabs of the marshes are returning to their ancient ecology. That area is being reflooded. Up to 1 million, we're not sure exactly, up to 1 million Iraqis have come home. There were 4.5 million exiles until last year, people who were unable to live in their own country. About 1 million of them have come back. These tend to be professional types with qualifications who've been living in exile in democratic societies. They have a right of return as well. And of course the effort is being made by the jihadists and the fascists not to give this a chance to breathe, not to let it develop a pulse, because they know they will lose. But the good bit is this. The US armed forces are acquiring daily, we are acquiring an army that has bitter, hard experience in nation building and countering jihad. Don't think, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to be needing this force again. It's going to be needed more and more as the war with jihad goes on and deepens and intensifies. And we're going to get much better at finding and eradicating, without pity, these people, and much better at working on projects like the marshes, like the empowerment of women, like the building of an electoral register. Yes, it's incredibly worthwhile.
I'd like to ask
we should be proud of having done it, and some states are getting the point. When Colonel Gaddafi wanted to capitulate, he said, okay, I'll give up my weapons. They're no use to me or anyone else. They're a threat, they're a nuisance. It was a huge mistake. I'll show you where they are. I'll give them up. And furthermore, I'll join you in the war against bin Laden. Did he go to Kofi Annan to make this offer? No. Did he go to Jacques Chirac to make this offer? No. He didn't. Did he go to Chancellor Schroeder? No, he did not. He came to Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush. He said, okay, that's it. I
Point
agree.
taken.
Regime change is a fact in the region and a necessity for Iraq.
I'd like to ask a question of Michael Ignatieff. Michael, you give very eloquent voice to your being troubled in the aftermath of the reasons first advanced for going to war in Iraq. You seem also to insist that a return to involvement of the United Nations on even a more vigorous level than perhaps is the case today continues to trouble you. And yet the administration itself has turned to the United Nations in a kind of de facto confession that it does in fact need the multilateralism of a world that its more unilateralist impulses had so vigorously spurned. And isn't it a more prudent and sensible course for the United States to involve itself in a more invigorated United Nations rather than trying to keep it at arm's length and so enfeebling the very institution that even the spinmeisters might concede would be the very fig leaf and conceit that the administration so desperately needs at this moment?
Look, I'm a pretty unequivocal, again, possibly in distinction from Chris and also in distinction from others, I'm a pretty strong believer in the United Nations under certain circumstances. There are few people whose political sagacity and wisdom I admire more than Lakhdar Brahimi, because I've been in Afghanistan and I see what this this wily old fox from Algeria was able to accomplish in terms of creating a political process in Afghanistan, and I'm hoping and praying, as I think we all should be, that this wily old fox can do it in Iraq. And I don't believe that this is impossible. But that's essentially the key part of a multilateral commitment. That is to get the political process out from under the Coalition Provisional Authority and into the hands of an international broker who has international legitimacy. I think Bob Scheer may have misunderstood my point about Kerry. I just don't think give it to the United Nations is actually a policy. I'm not opposed to that, but I think even Bob was saying he wants a stronger, clearer, more articulate policy that makes sense, and I feel the same way. I'm not opposed to multilateral involvement by the UN. I just think we've got some of it now, and it seems to me a fantasy to put this under a kind of UN trusteeship because of capacity problems. I just think if you go up to the 28th floor of the UN, as I occasionally do, and you ask them, could you run Iraq? They say, unfortunately, we cannot. So it's not an objection in principle to multilateral action. It's, you know, since Mark wants me to avoid dreaming, I do want to avoid dreaming. And there may be an element of wishing the UN to take this over that involves dreaming. The United States will have to stay centrally engaged. It should get other people in to contribute. It should get other countries to contribute to reconstruction, to development. But the political process has to be held by Lakhdar Brahimi. We need to support that. But the expectation that the UN can sort of take this burden off the United States electorate and just kick it into the long grass seems to me to be precisely what Mark doesn't want me to do, namely dreaming.
Steve, can I just respond to that?
Yep. Mark asks for a response to that. I'm going to give him a response, but I'd like to put a question to you as well. Why don't you respond for a minute or so, and then I'll ask a question.
Well, I just want to say, you know, there's always a point that we reach in these debates where the people who argued strongly for war say to the ones who objected that don't fixate on the past. Tell us what to do now. Don't fixate on the past. And when this happened in New York, I essentially said, I feel like a guy walking down the street, sees someone coming toward him, this person approaches and then punches him in the face. You're lying on the ground and you look up at this person and say, why did you hit me in the face? And that person says, don't fixate on the past.
Not very witty.
You know, I agree with Michael. I mean, I think Kerry's policy just to hand it over to the UN, the moment for that has passed, unfortunately. There isn't a UN. There are no UN forces. You need to get countries willing to supply troops to come in and do it. I agree with Michael on that point. I disagree with Bob. I don't think the U.S. can withdraw precipitously from Iraq. Unfortunately, I think we're caught there. We're adding troops now, not taking them out. The Pentagon at this point wanted to have 30,000 Americans. There are 135,000 now, and there will be more. So I don't think there's an easy way out. I think the political side of this has to be internationalized. It has to be given over to the United Nations. The U.S. has to open up reconstruction contracts and everything else to other countries. It has to be willing essentially to climb down from the position it took before the war of complete control of this occupation and of thumbing its nose at the international community. But I agree with Michael, it's going to be difficult, regardless. And the notion that there's a clear way out here and a clear solution, there might have been before the war if we'd had more troops. The original plan for the United States to have a 2-year occupation and a steady building of political parties over a period of years and enough occupation troops, that might have worked better. But at the moment, I don't see a clear solution for this. And the UN has to be a part of it, but it's not going to get the United States out of Iraq. Steve?
Is what you've painted here really a serious position, though, in the sense that you virtually concede that the United States has the resources and power on the ground in order to shape whatever immediate future will occur in Iraq. What is it that you actually mean when you say internationalization? What is it that you actually mean when you say involve the United Nations more heavily? How would that qualitatively, and by what means, reshape the present predicament?
I think the United Nations has to be given control of the political changeover in Iraq. I think the United States has to essentially appeal to the international community in a way it hasn't done before. It has to try to get NATO forces into Iraq. It has to try to persuade its allies to help it in some of the things that those forces can do in Iraq. But the fact is that the French, the Germans, I mean, as Bob has pointed out, there are very large majorities in those countries that don't want to do that. And so it is going to be difficult. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the lessons here is that it is very hard to make people Democrats by shooting them. It's very hard. You know, I've covered Haiti, I've covered Bosnia. I mean, Michael has been over the same ground, so have the others up here. I mean, it's very difficult to do this. And you have to look at the country and say, well, what's there? What are we starting with? And in Iraq, you have an artificial state that's been ruled by a minority, that has a majority that's desperate to take power, but whose taking of power is viewed by the U.S. policymakers as threatening. I mean, one of the problems now with handing over power is the U.S. Major policymakers here don't want radical Shiites to take power in Iraq. And as the occupation continues, the chance of that eventually happening grows ever greater. And that's the paradox that we're confronted with. I don't want to be negative. I mean, I take Michael's criticisms very much to heart. I'd like to stand up and give you a very clear op-ed page. You know, this is what we should do. We need a confederal solution. We need the UN on the political side. We should get out on such and such a date. But the fact is that these alternatives, one by one, have gone by the wayside. We haven't had enough troops to occupy the country and make it secure. Shinseki, before the war, said we need several 100,000. He didn't pick that number out of the air. That's what the army had determined you needed to secure the country. Well, we decided to do it with half that. We decided to dream our dreams about how easy this would be, and the fact is that we can't go back over those grounds. I agree with Michael that I think this is going to be very difficult. I think a lot more Americans are going to die. I think a lot more Iraqis are going to die. But I can't see a rationale that would envision just America pulling out and not leaving a complete civil war. So I'm stuck in the position, as someone wrote me an angry email called me a liberal supporter of the occupation, because I don't advocate pulling out precipitously. But having opposed the war and having argued again and again that the occupation would be bloody difficult, I don't see a way to get out instantly. It just doesn't seem to me to be, it seems to me to be, would be the cause of much greater bloodshed than there is now.
Thank you, Mark. Let me ask Bob Scheer a question. Mr. Scheer, you've made a very distinguished career pointing out human rights abuses in many places over many decades. And yet, in some of your remarks, while you have a kind of parenthetical acknowledgement of the vampiric qualities of the now deposed dictator Saddam Hussein, and you are quite vociferous when you point out the ways in which past administrations had coddled him, it seems to occupy a lesser place in your political, how to put it, your political cartography than the disingenuous hypocrisies of the American administration. And so one has rather the feeling that your empathy for the Iraqi people is somehow not as robust as your unhappiness at the paradoxes and predicaments of various American administrations as they pursue policies that you regard as inconsistent. Yet what are we to do? We are now in the debate over the weapons of mass destruction, while of continuing importance for the civic education of the polity, seems to have no genuine relevance in the construction of a policy that would actually take seriously what we are to do in the Iraq that we are now presented with, in which we now occupy. What is your position?
Well, I guess your assertion is I'm insensitive to Iraqi lives because I don't want to bomb them and shoot them and invade their cities. I think there is something wrong about saying the death of 4 Americans, I gather they were mercenaries, highly paid, who were in a country, I don't know who sent them there. We didn't vote to send them there. That can justify destroying a city. That seems to be the issue at Fallujah. Clearly, if we came to Iraq to free these people, we must believe they have the capacity to rule themselves. Saddam Hussein, maybe no one has noticed, is in jail. You know, their military was broken. And we have now admitted, finally, we have to include the Baathists. They're not all evil. They weren't all terrible people. So my argument would be, why not trust the Iraqis to make their own history? I don't see how that becomes an anti-human rights position. On the contrary, I think we have cheapened the coinage of human rights. I think that there is, first of all, we should intervene wherever genocide seems to be in the offing. I'm in favor of it. I was in favor of the invasion of Afghanistan. Before the invasion, I actually defended sending the cruise missiles in because I thought, again, these people had attacked our embassies, our ships. They clearly were one and the same, bin Laden, and we were able to do it with international support and understanding. So the issue is not going in to protect human lives. The issue is whether going in costs more in the way of human lives. And it's very easy to say here, oh, let's have some American soldiers. I'm thinking of the ones that I've met, and I'm not taking anything away from them. They're 2 years or a year, 3 years out of high school. They could hardly find Iraq on the map. They know nothing about this history. They've been lied to by their president that this has something to do with protecting our country. That's why the lies are important, because it's those troops that were lied to. And I know if we had a draft, let me assure you, the American public would not be at all as passive as it has been on this issue. You go ask those neighbors of yours. 60% of Californians in the LA Times poll said they don't think this is worth the cost of American lives. 2 to 1 in this state. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. We will now have closing remarks from each of the panelists. Christopher Hitchens.
Oh dear, I wasn't ready.
Well, these are events taking place.
How long
for which
are these closing
preparation
remarks? I know, I should have realized I was on television. How long are these closing remarks?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I'll probably be able to yield some of that time back to the other comrades. I think I have to say something about Vietnam in closing. The United States policy towards Vietnam was based upon an arbitrary partition of Vietnam that was imposed in 1954 and based on upholding that artificial partition. This is the first of the major differences. Though if the US was the sort of country people sometimes seem to think it is, it could let Iraq fragment and balkanize and probably do just as well in getting oil out of it that way. The attempt is being made to keep a federal democracy together. That's another difference. The Vietnamese government, even at its most Stalinist, was never accused of genocide. Nor did it invade neighboring countries, nor was it the prime suspect in sponsoring international terrorism. Saddam Hussein took credit personally, and we know from the bank records that he made good on it. For every suicide bomber in Palestine, there was a bounty. The heroes of the World Trade Center of 1994 found refuge in Iraq. I don't know how I can multiply any more the absurdity of the analogy with Vietnam and, as I said earlier, the appalling insult that it constitutes to our Vietnamese friends. The analogy, I'll say again, is with what might have happened. This is not to dwell on the past, nor is it to say to people, well, even if you oppose the war, you're stuck with it now. That's no part of our case. It's to say, what was your proposal then? What was your proposal faced with a maimed, torn, traumatized, violent Iraq, and with a crime family in charge of its gigantic resources and its enormously swollen armed forces, and with a psychopathic couple in the dynasty waiting to seize power? How long would you have let this run? Now, I don't think I've heard anything like an answer to that question from either of our two opponents today. They haven't even attempted it. Every time I've asked it, they've acted as if I hadn't brought it up, as if the Iraq Liberation Act had never been passed, as if the serial resolutions of the United Nations, with none of which Iraq would comply, had never been passed. Mr. Brahimi of the UN is a friend of mine. I used to know him when he was Algerian ambassador to London. He was quite a good envoy in Afghanistan, but his job was hopeless. Nothing happened in Afghanistan until American and NATO forces entered the country and forcibly removed the Taliban. That's the sheer fact of the matter. There was nothing the UN could do or had ever done about Afghanistan that compared to that act of determined unilateralism, if you wish. Mr. Brahimi is a member of the Algerian FLN. His government and party and armed forces had to fight a war against Islamic fascism in Algeria over the past decade. That's the real Battle of Algiers, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, in which probably 100 to 150,000 people were killed. The large majority of them, I'm happy to say, supporters of the jihad. That's what it took Algeria to win the civil war that's going on in the Islamic world. Are we spectators to this? Are we, as the word elective, I think, was used, an optional war? Are we really saying we are neutral in this civil war in the Islamic world? We'll wait and see how it comes out? It's none of our business. Let's let it run. Let's not get involved, because it sure is a quagmire to have a civil war in the Islamic world. It's a terrible thing. But it's not our choice. It's been forced upon us. The decision has been made by the enemies of civilization to try and win this war by bringing it to us. It is, in my opinion, therefore, a most excellent use of the United States Armed Forces, which are very large, indeed, and very well financed and very well paid for and trained, and very numerous, and all volunteers. No better use for them could be found than to involve them in the remaking of a society that is being and has been devastated by our enemies in this civil war. Not just to make sure that those enemies are ruthlessly defeated. And both Mr. Scheer and Mr. Danner were appallingly flippant about this. They both said, you can't change people's minds by shooting them, in effect, or we don't want to have to shoot or bomb anybody. In what world are they living? You don't make people Democrats by shooting them, but you can defend and protect the people who are Democrats by shooting those, by killing those who are determined to destroy democracy. There's no better cure for fascism has ever been found than lead poisoning on that scale. And I think we should be extremely proud of the young American and British and men and women of other nationalities too, who have taken on this task on our behalf. We have to wish them very well. And it would be a fool, and a wicked fool, who thought that if this enterprise fails, and it may, we are all alive to the possibilities of defeat, that if this enterprise fails, it will be defeat for President Bush. It takes a wicked fool to think that. It takes a wicked fool to think that, a gloating fool of the sort who I have heard a little of from today, to say that this would be only a defeat for Bush. It would be a defeat for civilization and for society entirely. And we have no choice but to regard it in that light.
Round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, the ladies and gentlemen among you. Thank you.
Please hold your applause and other remarks. Mark Danner.
Well, we're hearing again and again that this was a war that had to be fought. There was no choice. The regime was imploding. There would have been a Rwanda coming in Iraq. More and more exotic claims are proliferating. But you have a great advantage, all of you in the audience and all of you watching, which is that you were there. You watched what happened in the months before the war. You watched the slow effort of persuasion of the administration. You watched the vote in Congress. You watched the claims about weapons of mass destruction. You watched the claims about uranium from Africa, aluminum tubes, all the rest of it. And you know that this was a war of choice and not of necessity. Saddam, by the beginning of this war, was, as Bob put it, a defanged dictator. His armed forces were a third or a quarter of the size they were when the Gulf War was fought in '91. He had a bunch of 20-year-old rusting tanks. He had no weapons of mass destruction, as we've discovered. He did not pose a threat to the United States. He did not pose a threat to the region. He was a bloody tyrant, but the notion that the United States had to invade 13 months ago is ridiculous, and all of you know that it's not true. By the way, the 1998 Iraq Liberation Act does not require a war. As you may have noticed, the Clinton administration did not invade Iraq. And it's a bit of sophistry to say that again and again, as if the United States had committed to war in 1998. You know, sometimes things are as simple as they appear. And if you look at this, I think, just squarely, through the newspapers, through the news, you realize a couple of things. One is that the war came first, the rationale for it later. This was a war that the United States government, the Bush administration, wanted to fight. And then it went off in search of reasons. Michael has denounced the use of trumped-up evidence to support the war. He says he won't sign on for that. But at the same time, he admits that without that trumped-up evidence, the American people could not have been brought along, as he put it, to support the war. That's a contradiction for someone who believes in democracy. The question is, if you believe a war, government cannot convince its people to go to war, is the government legitimate in lying to the people? And is it legitimate to lying to the international community? Christopher's assertions about this war had to be fought to change minds, well, we have evidence about the changing of minds that have happened since this war was fought. And the evidence that we have, the polling from the Middle East, from the Islamic world, shows that the opinion of the United States, of the United States troops, of the United States government, has fallen catastrophically since this war was fought. And those numbers continue to go down. So if indeed this was a war to promote democracy throughout the Islamic world, if this was a war to change minds,
Change the balance of power, is what
if that was our purpose in Iraq,
Change the balance of power.
What we know thus far is that the minds are changing in the opposite direction.
Balance of power.
My problem with this war in the end is that I believe it has made us less safe. I believe at a time when the American armed forces were needed to fight in other venues, were needed in Afghanistan, were needed to protect this country, when the $200 billion that has already been spent in Iraq was needed to secure the ports, harbors, nuclear plants, chemical plants of this country. Instead, that money, those resources, and worst of all, those young American lives have been wasted in a war that didn't need to be fought. Everybody, it's natural for you to want hope. It's natural for you to reject a relentlessly negative view of what's going on. And I would try to give you some hope. My hope would be that the American people would have learned from the events of the last 13 years. My hope would be that Americans would take a more skeptical view of what their government says and what it does. My hope would be that instead of listening to our leaders and taking what they say on faith, we read the paper and look at the events in front of us and make our own decision. My hope would be that in the fall, decisions would be made that would lead to a different attitude in Iraq and a different attitude in fighting the war on terror. That is the most positive, I'm afraid, most positive view I can give you about Iraq, because the way in Iraq from now on is going to be bloody, frustrating, and difficult. And Michael said difficult. I agree with him. It's going to be difficult. And we can talk about the United Nations. We can talk about handing over political control. We can talk about bringing other countries in, countries that up to now we've spurned. But all of this is going to be increasingly hard because none of them want to get involved in a war that's going increasingly badly. I hope we can learn better for next time.
Closing remarks from Michael Ignatieff.
I want to start with wars of choice versus wars of necessity. I think everybody feels naturally that you don't want to fight wars of choice. You want to restrain the use of military force. You want to use it as a last resort. When my first remarks to you tonight, I said that I could justify preemptive war, but only as a last resort. But let's focus on one painful and unpleasant reality about war, which is this country has been at war for 20 years. From the bombing of the American embassy in Beirut in 1983 through a rising escalation of terror attacks, which we didn't connect as a sustained combat operation, and only woke up on 9/11, connecting the dots back over a 20-year rising escalation of attacks on American targets. They have been at war with us for 20 years. It seems to me at a certain point it would be appropriate to be at war with them. This war was not, in my judgment, a war of our choosing, a kind of needless wandering around the world in search of people to beat up. This war was started in 1983 by people we didn't even recognize as our enemies, and now only too palpably grasp that we are in a war. I'm not sure I'd characterize it exactly as Christopher Hitchens does, but I certainly know what side I'm on. Do I want them to win? You must be joking. Why? Because I love this country, I love its institutions, I have a passionate commitment to liberal democracy, as everybody on the other side of the panel does, and when it's attacked, I think we ought to defend it. So let's work beyond the wars of choice, wars of necessity dichotomy, and understand that war was declared against us.
In Iraq?
Then there's a question of how that war is fought, and there's an entirely legitimate disagreement about how we prosecute it. My sense of it is this, simple. I'll leave you with one simple thought. The national security of the United States, that is to say, the survival and health of liberal democracy as we know it in this country, is integrally related to the security of three other places. First of all, our security is related to the security of the state of Israel. A secure Israel within stable 1967 borders is in the national interest of the United States, self-evidently in the national interest of the Jewish people. Secondly, let me finish. Third, the third country in which our national security is deeply tied is in the rights of the Palestinian people to have a contiguous, viable state on the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, the security of the United States, the security of Israel, and the security of the Palestinians are locked together. One of the things that Bush has got wrong, and here I entirely agree with Bob Scheer, is greenlighting settlements on the West Bank is a problem because it makes the Palestinian state non-viable. If you don't have a Palestinian state, you have 100 years war in the Middle East, 100 years war which Israel cannot win and the United States cannot win. So we have to have the national security of the United States, the national security of Israel, the national security of Palestine linked together. And fourth and finally, and this is where Iraq comes in, you can't have all of those three linked together unless you have a stable, secure, democratic, federal Iraq. We're linked. These four elements have to come together. The Bush administration hasn't got it. The Kerry campaign, in my judgment, hasn't got it. But we had better get it because our security and the national safety of this republic depends on us understanding the relation national security of the United States, national security of Israel, national security of Palestine, and a free and democratic Iraq. It's all difficult, ladies and gentlemen. Everything worth doing is difficult. But we at least need to know what the target is, and that, believe me, is the target, and it's what I'm prepared to support.
Well.
Robert Scheer.
Yeah, I just want to say this has been a great session for me because all my life I was intimidated by the notion that people who went to Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge might have some wisdom. I only bring this up in this. I went to City College in New York, and we learned how to, you know, the whole idea of never bullshit a bullshitter. You know, I wouldn't bring this up in a personal way.
No, excuse me, it is worthy
the
of it.
language of O'Reilly of the language of O'Reilly and Limbaugh and others not used to denigrate those of us who dare differ as wicked fools, gloating fools. I am deeply offended at the idea that I am gloating over the loss of young Americans and Iraqis of all ages. I find that distasteful. I went back to Vietnam 7 years ago to report for Microsoft. I went to Cambodia. I know what it looks like to have people that have limbs on. I saw all the graves. I saw what we did to a country of Cambodia that did not need change, in which 2 million people died. I've had Ron Kovic come in my class with half of his body because he followed the John Wayne image and went to Vietnam and was so severely wounded. I resent the idea that people who favor peace gloat over American casualties, gloat over death. How dare you? How dare you suggest that? How dare you suggest that those of us who oppose this war, and a president who said he was not interested in nation building.
You have to materialize your accusation.
He said he was not interested in nation building.
If you're going to
lied to the American public.
You have to materialize the accusation.
He lied to the American public at every single point. We tried to stop this carnage before it happened. We tried to say this was unwise. You're the ones that told us it was absolutely necessary. You're the ones that told us there was this imminent threat to our security, that there were these weapons of mass destruction, which, by the way, David Kaye now says there is none. You don't even mention that. You're the ones that told us this war was absolutely essential. The UN had to be bypassed. And now you dare say that those of us who want to bring an end to it as quickly as possible, and I said, yes, use the UN as vigorously as possible, but don't let this drag on for 10, 15 more years. If you saw the movie Fog of War, where McNamara cries, you'll learn about how quagmires are made. The argument is, we're in, we can't just leave. Nonsense. You can just leave. You're going to make it worse. Worse. You know, so don't try to seize the moral high ground. And let me tell you something else. You know, there were plenty of us who said this whole idea, terror is international. First of all, you know enough about the Mideast to know that the Islamic fundamentalist terrorists and the secular dictators have not been on the same side. You know that. You know that in 1983, Saddam Hussein was our secular ally because he was taking on the Shiites of Iran. That's why we backed him. That's why Rumsfeld shook hands with him that year. You know that Sadat was killed by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So to say now, which side are you on? Which side are you on is to blur what the 9/11 Commission, by the way, is looking into, which this president has never been interested in. What was the role of Pakistan? What did the Saudis do? Why were there 15 of 19 hijackers from Saudi Arabia? Why were Saudis allowed to leave the country who needed to be interrogated? I wrote a column which I've been blasted on the internet. I wrote it in May before September 11th. I wrote it in the LA Times, and I said, why are we putting $43 million in aid and congratulating the Taliban for controlling the opium crop and not, demanding that they, not going in there and getting rid of bin Laden, who's already attacked us. And then in August, before September 11th, and we haven't talked at all about these revelations of the September 11th Commission, you want to make it suggest that we don't care about terror. You're ignoring this investigation, and what they have found out is this administration didn't care. And in fact, in August, before 9/11, 4 or 5 weeks before, Christina Roca from our State Department met with the Taliban ambassador in Pakistan and congratulated him once again on controlling the opium crop. And we know that Condi Rice's speech prepared for September 11th was on this idiocy of Star Wars protection and wasn't going to mention terrorism. So we have an ample record here of indifference to terrorism. We know that our intervention in the past, overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran, which produced eventually the Ayatollah, bringing Saddam Hussein as someone who could assassinate Qasem. He was one of our guys, Saddam Hussein. Then you turn around after we try to work with him as an ally for 10 years, and you're going to blame the two of us here somehow for not being vigorous enough in getting rid of him. The guy has been gotten rid of. The country we were going to liberate is liberated. Why don't we let those people vote? Why are we against elections? That's the big issue here. If we claim we're interested in democracy, why will we not trust the Iraqi people to control their own country?
Pathetic. We shall... Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt but that the Gordian knot that is presented to us by the mess in Mesopotamia involves more issues and more unresolved questions than, alas, we have time for. But what is certain is that the greatest number of people with opinions who really matter are you in the audience and you watching this program. For it is your active participation in this debate which should treat all of these issues and as yet unasked questions that it is important for you to attend to as the days unfold and as the next year goes by. Thank you very much for your attention.
A two-hour panel wrapping up entitled U.S. and Iraq 1 year later, the right to get in, wrong to get out. And you're watching live coverage on Book TV of the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. And we're bringing you this live all day today, and we were here yesterday. We're going to continue this discussion by opening up the phone lines and inviting you to join us. If you disagree with the war in Iraq, 202-585-3890. If you agree with the war, 202-585-3891. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to open up our phone lines, invite you to join us, react to the panel that you just saw, and give us some of your thoughts. And you'll also be able to question the guests that we have just outside Royce Hall. Joining us out here on the quad in UCLA campus is James Mann. Mr. Mann is the author of the new book called Rise of the Vulcan, The History of the Bush War Cabinet. Hello, Mr. Mann.
Hi, how are you, Connie?
Fine, thanks. You were in Royce Hall listening to all this.
I was.
What is your reaction to what you heard this morning?
I thought, I live and work in Washington, D.C. I wish there was that sort of debate in Washington, D.C. That's one of the best debates on the war and the current situation that I've seen. In some ways, I wish that the United States Congress was able to have that kind of debate.
Well, what made it provocative for you or useful for you?
Well, two things, really. One was that you had people with real convictions and with real emotion challenging one another's assumptions. This isn't, these aren't politicians. These are people with deep beliefs, and you got the whole spectrum there. And secondly, these same people had a debate a year ago on the war, so you get the breadth of looking at how people's views have evolved over the past year.
Okay, in your opinion, which one of the views in there was most right on? Can you choose one, or some hybrid of them?
You know what? My own book is a 30-year history of how did these guys in this administration, guys and women in the case of Condoleezza Rice, come to have the views that they do. And it's an exploration of how this evolved, and I try to avoid what I call preaching to the choir on one side or another. I'm trying to explain it. And so I avoid the whole villains and heroes approach.
Well, can you tell us then, what did you hear about any of the 6 people who you profile in your book that maybe not was necessarily new to you, but you thought was interesting?
A lot of the focus in there was on Paul Wolfowitz. That's understandable because he's in many ways the theoretician of the Bush administration. And I heard. What I didn't hear was the breadth and the history of his views, which have evolved all the way since the 1970s, when he was really the first person to focus on Iraq as a military threat, and it was based on not on human rights abuses, but on oil.
Okay, James Mann is going to join us. Our phone lines are open. You can join us now, and I think our first call is from Atlanta. Is that correct?
Yes. I'd like to ask
Atlanta.
you a question as to why President Bush and his gang saw fit to run ahead of the UN rather than to wait for them to complete their inspections and so forth and legitimize his operation more, other than the fact that he may have wanted to seize control of the decision-making and of the oil assets, the contracts, and so forth. That's the only...
Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of.
Thanks, caller. And can you take that in terms of your book and the people in your book and how they brought to the whole issue of the involvement of the UN or lack of involvement?
You know, in the late 1990s, these Vulcans, the Republicans, developed a set of beliefs about America's allies. They were reluctant to admit that the United States didn't need allies because most of them had been involved in the first Gulf War, where the coalition that was put together was crucial. So they developed these theories that if the United States did something, the allies would follow. I call it the strength hypothesis in the book, that the allies were just followers. And that turned out to be, in this case, that turned out to be wrong. They misjudged America's allies. They spent all this time in the mid-1990s developing these assumptions about American allies that really, when it came to it in 2002 and 2003, turned out not to be true.
Raleigh, North Carolina, hello.
Hey, how you doing? It's great to be on this afternoon.
Fine, thanks.
I really was enamored and enthused by the debate itself. I wanted to focus a bit on the closing arguments of Mr. Hitchens and Ignatieff. I believe they encapsulated one argument that the people that oppose the war will not and never have faced. What do you do in a realistic manner? You have this festering sore in the Middle East that had to be dealt with. For 10 years we used no-fly zones, but at what point does reality come into play that sometimes war is not an option that you want to take, but things must occur and be dealt with at some point. I served in the Marine Corps, so I'm not a person who is speaking from a point of view who sits in an ivory tower and says, hey, go. I served in the Marine Corps. I've been to the Middle East, and for the majority's sake, we had to deal with terrorism on a global scale. Global meant not just Afghanistan, but rooting out the opportunities of actions which I believe that are going to occur before the next election. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mann.
You know, this argument, we have to do something, we have to do it now. Again, I explore the roots of that in my book. It's got a long history. It goes back to the Cold War. The argument that was made in the Cold War was, you know, we have to act now or the Soviets are going to overtake us, the Soviets are going to get us. It's a recurrent theme that comes up and has come up with the people in this administration. The caller is right and got a point that sometimes the opponents of war just, you know, tend to gloss over, well, what was going to happen otherwise. You know, nevertheless, they don't have a point in saying, saying something had to be done now.
James.
There was, a degree of patience would have helped.
We are live at the 9th annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. We have been here all day yesterday, and we're here today. We have about 4 more hours, but this panel discussion this morning, I think, was one of the highlights so far. And again, as Mr. Mann said, it was a continuation of this discussion that started last year. It'll be interesting to know if a year from now we have the same discussion again.
Round 3.
Yeah, Marion, Ohio, you're next for James Mann. Hello.
Thank you, Steve Bann, for such an incredible education here. I wish I had 30 minutes to talk to you. 2 days before 9/11, Dan Burton, Senator Dan Burton, and other people probably who watch this program, was complaining that he couldn't get information from the Justice Department. He was part of the Senate Committee on Intelligence, they were closed as a clam. He was talking about something like some drug dealer that was not picked up by a big drug dealer because he'd given some contributions to some political party. And he was trying to get some other information. This secrecy started before 9/11 was tight as a clamshell. And I just want to say that when you look at the drug on war, if this war on terrorism goes the way of the war on drugs, when you look at the mistakes, the CIA, all these subversive elements that we've supported, it now has ended up being drugs in the veins of our people here, and it's continuing to support terrorism. If we look at the secrecy and we don't open this up, this is going to go the way of the war on drugs, and we are done. And I just want to say, God bless America.
James Mann, thank you. Thanks, caller.
I guess I'd take it back further than the caller. Secrecy didn't start with the war on terrorism or with the war on drugs. The secrecy has been extraordinary over the last couple of years. But, you know, I listen to White House correspondents say this administration is so bottled up, and I have to admit that the first Bush administration was in some ways even more bottled up. That with this administration, they almost can't help themselves. But you see, I mean, you're seeing in you know, my book and many others, the whole people can't keep their disagreements secret. They're right out there. I found in doing other books on the first Bush and part of this book on the first Bush administration, sometimes they disagreed and you'd never know about it for 5 years. So I think this administration is more secretive than anyone else from day to day, but in the larger sense, you know, their disagreements are so strong that they're not secretive.
I think it was Robert Scheer in the panel discussion who talked a little bit about the importance of Dick Cheney in all of this, and he obviously is one of the 6 people that you talk a lot about.
I call him the senior, you know, the chief of the Vulcans, really.
As we stand here live in April, we're just 2 days away from the Supreme Court taking up the whole issue of the Energy Task Force and whether that should have been closed or not. How do you see his influence now, how it's changed in the 30 years that you looked at it?
You know, it's interesting. He's been at the peak of his influence, I would say, in the first 2 to 3 years of this administration, possibly only a little less so now, because, you know, President Bush has been in office for 4 years and may rely on him slightly less than before. But really, he's the guy who had the experience, really sort of speaks for the experiences of the first Gulf War, and really has, beyond that, a whole network of people throughout the administration who worked for him, including the Secretary of Defense. And I explained in the book, there's a chapter it's called Who Runs the Pentagon, about the transition between when as Bush is putting together his administration, I was going to say after Bush's victory, but after the Supreme Court decision at the end of 2000, just filling out his cabinet, he was about to name Don Rumsfeld. It looked like he was going to be CIA director, and there was going to be a politician like Tom Ridge who would be Secretary of Defense. And you got a reaction within the Republican Party, conservatives, and really Cheney played a key role on this. Rumsfeld was brought in specifically to keep Colin Powell in check, to limit his influence. So, you know, you can't begin to think of the influence in this administration. It really starts with Cheney.
And of course, this will be the week that Mr. Cheney and the president testified before the 9/11 Commission too. Together, which is key in your argument. Well, I mean, it's part of the whole issue.
There are. I'm sure that there are other reasons. They don't want to testify separately and have their answers compared. Nevertheless, it's interesting that Bush is going there with Cheney.
Washington, D.C., you're next with James Mann. Hello.
Hello? Hello?
You're on the air. Go ahead, Washington.
Okay. I'm calling...
Please go ahead with your question.
Well, I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. As a mother of children who also lost 5 friends in Kenner Fitzgerald in the World Trade Center and had to explain to my children how this happened, and looking at Saddam Hussein as someone who supported the Taliban, yes, I was very angry, but more so I looked at the women and children of Afghanistan and Iraq who were not allowed to be themselves and a democracy, and I really don't find a problem that we haven't found weapons of mass destruction because we knew he was used genocide against his people. And I also want to say that I think these debates were wonderful because it's very difficult for me to understand how so many people are not supporting Bush, where I feel like he just went in there and did the best thing he could do in defending our country. And I've never been very clear in understanding the Democrats' side of our opinion. And I feel very educated, and I really appreciate your program. And it's going to give me food for thought.
Washington. We'll leave it at that. Thank you. Mr. Mann, reaction?
Well, I'll put aside the political parts of that and the partisan parts, but I will say on Saddam Hussein's crimes against his people, which were extraordinary, that many of them occurred in the 1980s. And the United States didn't see fit to go to war until 2003, and that tends to undercut. And when it did go to war, it did so with a rationale of weapons of mass destruction, not the crimes against his people. So it's kind of a fuzzy argument, I think, to say we went to war to stop the crimes against humanity when we waited 20 years. And during that time, we gave a considerable support to Saddam Hussein. And to me, it undercuts the argument.
James Mann is a writer in residence at the CSIS. You hear that a lot on C-SPAN because we cover a lot of their panels. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is what?
It's a Washington think tank that specializes in defense issues.
And what's next?
You'll find in there a picture of, this is apropos of the last caller, of the famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein on a mission in 1983.
What's next for you?
I'm going to write another book, but I don't quite know yet exactly what that will be.
Have you been surprised at the reaction from your book and the attention it's gotten?
I've been amazed, yeah. There's just, and as I travel around the country, as I've done a book tour, the level of interest in this administration and in the election is remarkable. There's just, a lot of passion out there, a lot of conspiracy theories. People are really geared up.
James Mann, thanks very much. Appreciate talking to you. This is certainly a warmer day than we've seen in Washington, D.C. in a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Till August. Thanks.
We are live at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, and one of the things that we had mentioned